It was supposed to be a closed-door economic summit. Washington, D.C., high ceilings, guarded elevators, filtered press. Inside the Treasury building, Scott Bessent, the newly appointed secretary, stood tall. Calm. Calculated. He'd spent his career orchestrating markets, managing billion-dollar hedge funds, and pulling strings most people didn't know existed. Across from him sat Ibrahim Traoré. The world called him young, defiant, radical. But in this room, he looked every bit like a man who had seen empires come and go, and wasn't impressed by either. "Mr. President," Bessent began, smoothing his tie. "Let's be honest. Your country runs on our reserves. Our aid. Our systems." Traoré didn't blink. He just stared. Waiting. Bessent leaned in, his voice lower now. "You depend on our money." Silence followed. The room tensed. Traoré leaned forward slowly, voice steady, unshaken. "And you," he said, "depend on our ground." The American aide beside Bessent raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Traoré continued. "Your tech needs lithium. Your planes need uranium. Your batteries? Cobalt. And it's our soil that bleeds all of it." Bessent smiled. "We pay for that." "No," Traoré replied. "You manipulate for that. Through currency, debt, and distraction." The room chilled. A map sat on the digital wall behind them, resource flows, trade patterns, supply chains. Traoré stood and walked to it. "This map doesn't scare me. It excites me. Because now we know what you value, and we control where it comes from." He turned to face the most powerful banker in the room and said, "So let me ask you, Secretary, when the dollar drops, and the ground stops giving, what will you depend on then?" For the first time, Bessent had no answer. 3 days after that closed-door confrontation, the world heard what no one was supposed to. A leaked audio recording, muffled but clear enough, was released by an anonymous whistleblower. The clip lasted 38 seconds. Long enough to ignite headlines. Bessent's voice, "He's a child playing with gasoline." Traoré's voice, "Then maybe it's time the fire reached your banks." The internet erupted. Major networks tried to stay neutral. But social media didn't. Within hours, hashtags were trending globally. Hashtag ground over gold. Hashtag Traoré versus Treasury. Hashtag debt isn't destiny. In Ouagadougou, students marched with cardboard signs reading, "Our minerals. Our rules." Meanwhile in D.C., the Treasury Department scrambled to contain the fallout. Bessent didn't deny the leak. But he doubled down. In an emergency press briefing, he said, "We respect sovereign nations, but fiscal discipline is not optional. You can't dig pride out of the ground and call it currency." It was meant to sound firm. Strategic. But it backfired, badly. Because the next morning, Traoré released a single-page response titled, "You can't eat interest." It read, "When your loans come due, you ask for meetings. When our people go hungry, you offer seminars. We are done trading lives for ledgers." It was published in The Guardian, Le Monde, and The New York Times, on the same day. Financial markets took notice. Burkina Faso's mining partners began renegotiating their terms, with Traoré, not Washington. Behind closed doors, Wall Street murmurs grew louder. Is he bluffing? No, he's betting on something we never priced in, dignity. Scott Bessent wasn't just facing a bold leader anymore. He was facing an idea too big to control with bonds and balance sheets. And Traoré? He hadn't shouted. He hadn't threatened. He'd just made the world choose between control and conscience. Markets love confidence. But what happened next shook it. In the week following Traoré's letter, resource-linked ETFs, especially those tied to African minerals, began to fluctuate. Minor, at first. But erratic. Too erratic for comfort. Investment firms called emergency analysts. Washington's Treasury Task Force issued memos marked sensitive, eyes only. And Scott Bessent, no longer calm, requested a meeting, not in private, but on the record. He wanted a summit. In New York. Public. Televised. The White House wasn't thrilled, but the optics of transparency were too tempting. They extended the invitation to Traoré. He said yes, with one condition. No podiums. No protocols. Just 2 men. 2 chairs. And one truth. On the day of the summit, the UN chamber buzzed like a stock floor. Global CEOs, diplomats, journalists, they all came, not for policy. But for a reckoning. Bessent entered first, suited in steel gray, flanked by aides and economists. Traoré walked in second. No papers. No tablet. No entourage. Just a plain brown folder in his hand, labeled. Where it comes from. The moderator, a respected economic journalist, opened with a question for Bessent. Do you believe Burkina Faso needs the US dollar to survive? Bessent nodded. Not just Burkina Faso. The world. He turned toward Traoré and added. You can have your ground. But without global capital, it's just dirt. The room froze. Traoré didn't flinch. He opened the brown folder. Inside were satellite images, dozens of them, mining sites, shipping routes, contract logs, all signed by Western firms. Then he spoke. You call it dirt. But your jets run on this dirt. Your hospitals store energy in this dirt. Your semiconductors are etched with this dirt. He looked up. So the next time you call it just ground. Try going a week without touching it. Gasps. Then silence. And in that silence, the illusion cracked, that money always outranked matter, that signatures outweighed soil. Traoré hadn't come to fight. He came to remind them. The world runs on what they forgot to respect. After the summit, something strange happened. Traoré returned to Burkina Faso without giving a single interview. No tweets. No press statements. No photo ops. Nothing. That silence, intentional, precise, became louder than any speech. Meanwhile, the West buzzed with noise. Scott Bessent made 3 TV appearances in 2 days, attempting to reframe the narrative. This isn't about resources. It's about responsibility. Africa needs institutions. We are those institutions. But no one quoted him. They were still quoting Traoré. Try going a week without touching it. The silence was working. In Germany, a rare earth supplier paused negotiations with an American defense contractor. In Japan, a lithium importer redirected inquiries to Ouagadougou. In Brazil, students painted murals with the words, "We don't beg. We bear the earth." Washington grew nervous. The Treasury Department quietly reached out to African leaders, offering development partnerships. Most didn't decline. They just didn't answer. Because Traoré had reminded them of something they hadn't realized they possessed. Leverage. Not in speeches. Not in GDP charts. But in the one thing that can't be printed, forged, or replaced, land. And the man who triggered it? He was planting trees back home. Literally. One journalist caught a glimpse of him, sleeves rolled up, shoveling red soil beside schoolchildren. No cameras. No ceremony. Just a quiet leader reminding the world that real power doesn't always come with volume. Sometimes, it comes with roots. Washington doesn't stay quiet for long. 2 weeks after the summit, with pressure mounting and media narratives slipping out of their grip, the U.S. Treasury took action. A formal notice was issued. Effective immediately, sanctions will be placed on mineral exports originating from Burkina Faso to the United States, citing instability in regulatory compliance and nationalization concerns. In other words, a warning shot. The goal was clear. Remind Traoré that the dollar still had teeth. But the reaction was not what Bessent expected. Traoré didn't hold a press conference. He didn't tweet. He didn't even acknowledge the sanction. Instead, he flew to Istanbul. Then to Shanghai. Then to Brasilia. And in each capital, he met with energy ministers and trade officials, off camera, no translators, no media. By the time he returned to Ouagadougou, 3 things had happened. 1. China had agreed to fund and fast-track a railway from Burkina Faso's southern mines straight to West African ports. 2. Turkey committed to building a mineral processing plant, employing only local workers. 3. Brazil announced a new trade bloc proposal, excluding the U.S., with African minerals at its center. Washington was stunned. Wall Street whispered in confusion. How did he move that fast? Where's his economic advisor? Who's writing his strategy? The answer was simple. He wasn't playing their game. He was building his own board. And the more they sanctioned, the more the world watched. Traoré finally broke his silence in a short televised message. You tried to lock the gates. We built new roads. You thought sanctions would silence us. They only reminded us to speak to different ears. The audience applauded. But more importantly, investors listened. While Bessent held meetings in glass towers, Traoré met people in open fields. But it was precisely that contrast that shifted the tide. Because now it wasn't just governments watching. It was markets. Real ones. A quiet report landed on Bessent's desk, stamped confidential, Level 3 clearance. It wasn't from a diplomat or a treasury analyst. It was from a hedge fund manager on Wall Street. Emerging capital is bypassing U.S.-denominated routes. Bulk mineral futures show diversion patterns. Commodity flows are following Traoré, not Bessent. Translation. Money was moving. But not where Washington wanted it. In New York, 3 major private equity firms suddenly paused African extraction deals. Why? Because their legal teams feared new resource sovereignty clauses that local governments were drafting, inspired by Traoré. Meanwhile, in West Africa, something once unthinkable began to happen. Burkina Faso started pricing select mineral contracts in gold grams, not dollars. No country had dared that openly since Gaddafi tried it decades earlier. And yet here Traoré was, young, composed, undeterred. On a live broadcast from Ouagadougou, he said, "If you base everything on your currency, you are always one collapse away from losing everything. But if you build on value, real value, no sanction, no banker, no spreadsheet can erase you." The audience wasn't just African. Indian economists applauded. Brazilian commentators nodded. And in a closed-door meeting in Paris, a former IMF director whispered, "Is this a new doctrine?" Bessent, watching from a treasury office, knew the threat wasn't a rebellion. It was a formula. Silent diplomacy. Resource clarity. And monetary independence. It was the first time in his career he saw a nation with little money move entire markets, with nothing but minerals and conviction. And for the first time, he wasn't sure how to stop it. Washington's frustration boiled over. They needed Traoré boxed in, or at least publicly embarrassed. So they turned to their most reliable tool, the televised hearing. A Global Resource Oversight Committee was quickly assembled, complete with flags, suited interrogators, and a stack of scripted questions. They extended a formal invite to Traoré, expecting him to decline. He didn't. He showed up early. No notes. No prep team. Just him, and a pen. The chairman, Senator Holt, leaned in for the first blow. Mr. Traoré, do you understand the economic risk you're imposing on your own people by rejecting dollar-based frameworks? Traoré smiled, not smug, unbothered. Do you understand the risk you've imposed on ours by forcing them? Silence. Another congressman jumped in. Do you really believe African minerals can sustain your economy without Western finance? Traoré leaned closer to the mic. You don't finance our minerals. You finance your control over them. And we're correcting that invoice, starting now. A few committee members shifted in their seats. The session was meant to corner him. But Traoré had walked in with a key. He pulled a document from his coat, a copy of a 1998 U.S.-Africa mineral agreement, long buried in legal archives. It detailed revenue splits where African nations received less than 3% of profits from extraction. This is your idea of partnership? This is theft in a suit. The screen cut to stunned committee members. One aide whispered off mic, who gave him that document? He didn't need a source. We found it, Traoré said plainly. It was lying beneath your confidence. By the end of the hearing, it wasn't Traoré who looked isolated. It was the panel. Their suits looked stiff. Their questions, tired. And their grip on the narrative? Gone. After the hearing, something shifted, not just in Washington, but everywhere. It wasn't just what Traoré said. It was what he didn't have to say anymore. Young African leaders began quoting him without naming him. University lectures in Nairobi, Lagos, and Kinshasa introduced a new term. Sovereign economics. Not tied to the dollar. Not pegged to Western indexes. But rooted in what the earth beneath their feet actually held. Traoré never claimed ownership of the idea. He simply embodied it. Meanwhile, Scott Bessent was watching the markets with growing unease. An internal Treasury memo landed on his desk marked Urgent, Asset Flow Disruptions. Inside were charts. Copper flow from West Africa, down 22% to U.S. buyers. Rare earth shipments, rerouted to Eurasian partners. Gold extraction agreements, renegotiated in local currency. What unnerved Bessent wasn't the numbers. It was the writing scrawled in red pen by one of his own analysts. The world isn't rejecting America. They're just listening to someone else. Bessent called an emergency roundtable with the World Bank, IMF reps, and major private investors. He opened with a hard question. How did a country with no central bank independence become more credible than us? Nobody answered. Because the truth was unspoken, but clear. Credibility isn't built with cash. It's built with clarity. And Traoré never promised miracles. He promised dignity in exchange for honesty. That was the real currency now. And somewhere deep down, Bessent understood. For the first time in his career, he wasn't fighting debt. He was fighting memory. For decades, the United States thrived on something subtle, the illusion of inevitability. The dollar didn't just dominate because it was strong. It dominated because no one could imagine a world without it. But now? Thanks to Traoré, someone had drawn a map out. Burkina Faso hadn't become a superpower. It didn't need to. It had become a signal. A signal that the quiet advantage. The unspoken trust that America's economic design couldn't be challenged, was no longer absolute. One morning, Bessent was handed a classified report. 10 African nations now evaluating dual pricing strategies in trade contracts. 5 exploring local clearinghouses. 2 already bypassing SWIFT for regional partners. The memo was titled Emerging Decentralizations. Bessent paced in his office. He wasn't angry. He was disoriented. All his models had been based on compliance, not defiance. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. A journalist had reached out requesting a comment on a leaked G7 discussion. Should we pressure Traoré into softening his trade position through IMF levers? Bessent said nothing. Because the last time they tried pressure, Traoré turned it into a platform. And when they tried silence, he turned it into strategy. Traoré wasn't yelling, marching, or demanding. He was simply planting permanence where others printed paper. That week, the IMF quietly reached out to Burkina Faso's finance minister to initiate a dialogue. They received no response. Instead, a press release came from Traoré's office. "We do not reject cooperation. We reject control disguised as help." And just like that, the center of gravity shifted again. Bessent wasn't fighting numbers anymore. He was fighting narratives. And Traoré? He wasn't just leading a country now. He was leading a correction. In the end, there was no war. No embargo. No regime change. Just a quiet realization in Washington's inner circles. The old rules weren't rules anymore. Traoré never declared victory, because to him, this wasn't a game. It was about realigning respect. 1 year after that first closed-door meeting, Bessent was scheduled to speak at the World Monetary Forum in Zurich. The event had once been the domain of polished bankers and confident economists. But now, the crowd looked different. Younger. More skeptical. More curious. Midway through his speech, Bessent paused. He looked out at the audience, then said something no one expected. "I once told a leader, you depend on our money. But I now realize. It's we who have depended on a silence that no longer exists." There was no applause. Only stillness. Because truth doesn't always earn cheers. Sometimes it earns change. Later that evening, Traoré gave his own address, remotely, from a classroom in Burkina Faso. He stood in front of a chalkboard, beside students in school uniforms. No stage. No teleprompter. He spoke softly. "We were told progress comes from following systems. But systems built on imbalance don't lead. They extract. We aren't leaving the table. We're just bringing our own chairs." And with that, he closed the laptop. The camera zoomed out, not on a palace or an army, but on a map behind him. Marked not with borders, but with resources, rivers, and soil types. The real lines of power. Lines that had always been there, but were now, finally, being drawn by the people who lived on them. They told him his country was too small. His economy too weak. His resistance, naive. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He simply held up a mirror. To a world that forgot who fuels it. And who it's been draining dry. While Scott Bessent spoke in the language of credit ratings and contracts, Traoré spoke in the language of minerals, memory, and meaning. He didn't beg for respect. He revealed its price. And in doing so, he didn't just shake a Treasury Secretary. He exposed the foundation beneath an entire global system. So the next time they say, "You depend on our money," they might want to ask themselves, what happens when the ground stops giving? This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. And Traoré didn't ask for it. He built it.